So awesome. Well, I'm so excited that you all have joined tonight. We're going to go through all 4 wines from February's CruBox, which is titled Revisiting the Classics. So for this month, what we wanted to kind of focus on, when we're always starting to kind of figure out these themes each month for CruBox, myself and Gordon's wine director, Ian, we sit down and kind of think about some really interesting things to cover. And sometimes it's very focused, like last month where we focused on Alsace, but sometimes it's a little bit more broad, and it's things that we kind of get really excited about chatting about. So something that we've always been really focused on with Gordon's is the classics. So we love French wine. We love a lot of the kind of the world's and European classic regions of the world. So we wanted to revisit some of those classics tonight. And I think when you think about sometimes the classics with wine, you can sometimes think that they can be a little boring or dull, just because they're sometimes more widely available and things that have been, explored maybe in greater detail. And I think today too with wine, you see so many up and coming regions, or maybe regions you haven't heard of before, and a lot of these kind of exciting producers. And it's easy sometimes to get caught up in some of these like weird and wacky wines. And while sometimes they can be very interesting, it's sometimes really fun to kind of go back to kind of what inspired it all. So tonight wanted to offer up 4 different wines that come from classic areas, most of which grape varietals we've explored before, but we can kind of get into some greater detail. And we'll taste through sparkling, white, and 2 reds. If you have them on you and you're tasting them all, that's great. And if you're just opening up one or none, that's fine too. So without further ado, I'll start to go into the first wine, which is the Moutard. Let's see, I'll grab it right now. So the Champagne Moutard non-vintage Grand Cru Brut, which is our first wine. So I'm gonna just start off by saying that I don't know if anybody else had this experience when opening the bottle, if anybody has opened this, but I actually had one of my hardest experiences opening this bottle of champagne.
It sucked. It was really hard.
So hard. And it's so interesting too, because I've had this champagne so many times before, and I've never had this issue before. So it was just so interesting. And I literally struggled. I actually had to end up putting a corkscrew in it very slowly while still holding onto the cork to open it, which I don't have very strong hands, but I can always open a bottle of champagne. So I was a little surprised about that this time around. And I'm sorry if anybody else had that experience. But that being said, this is a producer that had.
Elsie, maybe you should get a saber.
I know I should have broken out the saber on a Monday night. I don't know what I was thinking. That would have been a lot more fun than my experience. But I guess the thing is, with, opening sparkling wine or champagne, I always am very careful about opening, just because there are so many atmospheres of pressure, usually about 5 to 6 in a bottle of champagne. So I'm usually very, very diligent about it. And this time it was just a little wacky. So sorry if anybody had that experience.
Yeah. I mean, what I think I noticed is that the opening of the bottle is smaller than usual.
Yeah, I think that is part of the issue, is they changed up the lip here of the bottle, and I think it made it much more complicated to extract out the cork. So interesting design change there. Not my favorite, but the juice is good.
Let's hope it's worth it.
It really is. So this has been a producer of ours that actually we've worked with probably about the last 3 or 4 years. With Gordon's, we're always trying to find like a great house champagne, and we always do like to focus on smaller champagne houses if possible. While we sell a ton of Veuve Clicquot, Yellow Label, and a ton of Bollinger and kind of all of the kind of classic producers you think of, we do really like to emphasize some of these smaller family-owned wineries. And Moutard was something that we came across from one of our favorite importers, Vineyard Road, and we've done a lot of work with them ever since then. It's kind of like our go-to house champagne. It's something that you can find in that $40-ish price point that's of really high quality. And I'm going to pull up a quick map for you guys, because I'm going to show you where they are, because I think it'll be really helpful to understand. So hold on one sec as I share my screen. Let's do this. We're doing it. Okay. Hope everybody can see it. Please give me a thumbs up just to say yes. Awesome. Cool. Okay. So what I thought was really interesting just with this map here, and it might be a little difficult to make out, but we'll go to another map next, is we have basically three different things that Famille Moutard specializes in. They specialize in Champagne, they specialize in wines of Burgundy or Bourgogne, and then they have a distillery as well, where they're making some distilled spirits made from grapes. So what's interesting here is with their sparkling wines from Champagne, they're actually in a specific area that is a little different, a little outside of the traditional growing area of Champagne, which is called the Côte de Bar, which it actually says right here on the front of the label. So you can see up here that the Côte de Bar is actually going to be north of Burgundy. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay. So here we can see we have a map of Champagne so we can kind of understand. The three main regions that we typically be working with in Champagne are the Vallée de la Marne, the Montagne de Reims, and then the Côte de Blanc. Côte de Saison is not, as you can see in the kind of southwest, not as well known. And you'll find that typically the Vallée de la Marne is known mostly for Pinot Meunier, a red grape varietal, kind of a distant cousin of Pinot Noir. The Côte de Blanc in the green is known mostly for a lot of Chardonnay production. And the Montagne de Reims is known primarily for mostly Pinot Noir production. So while you can find Champagne from all regions that are blends of all of those three grapes and some of the other varietals permitted in Champagne, those are the grapes that kind of typically grow best in those specific areas. You can actually see that the Côte de Bar is going to be in the southeast. So southeast of Champagne, but still traditionally in the Champagne region. Actually, for a very long period of time, the larger area of Aube, which is where the Vallée de la Marne, Côte de Blanc, and Montagne de Reims live, actually did not want Côte de Bar to be in the same Champagne classification because it was such farther distance. It's actually about 2 hours from Reims, so it's not right next door. And it's actually closer, as you can see, to Burgundy than it is to Champagne, and actually very, very close to Chablis. So this is really interesting. What you found is that the Côte de Bar for a very long period of time was actually supplying a lot of grapes for a lot of the négociant Champagne producers in some of the more traditional areas of Champagne. And they're mostly growers for a long period of time. And you found too, I think in about the, just within the last 20 years, a lot of like growers starting to like grow their own fruit and actually really showcase the Côte de Bar in a different way. I'm going to stop this share for a second. Awesome. So what's really interesting here is, so we have family owned, the Moutard family. They have been making wine since the 17th century. Their Grand Cru coming from the Côte de Bar, which is kind of their also kind of house largest production champagne in their estate, is 100% Pinot Noir. And what's interesting here is the Côte de Bar is actually predominantly Pinot Noir production. So even though it's actually closer to Chablis in northern Burgundy, which is where actually mostly Chardonnay grows, they found that Pinot Noir tends to grow really well here. And what's really interesting too is you actually have the same soil that you do in the Chablis region, which is called Kimmeridgian soil. It's a chalky kind of clay-based soil, which gives the wines really beautiful just texture, kind of freshness, but also you get like power and depth of fruit here as well. This wine is made with the secondary fermentation in the bottle, which is what makes Champagne so traditional. Typically, to be called Champagne, you have a minimum aging requirement in bottle, typically of about 14 months. But what's interesting about Famille Moutard is they actually age their non-vintage for a minimum of 36 months on the lees. So they go really beyond what they need to do to kind of create something that's a little bit more toasty, a little bit more kind of full and rich. You'll also find in here as well that there's something called dosage within Champagne. So once again, dosage is you add it towards the end. It's typically a combination of reserve wine and a little kind of sugar solution, which basically can sometimes add a little bit more residual sugar to the sparkling wine, as many sparkling wines in Champagne are grown in cooler climate areas. Sometimes the wines can be very abrasive and kind of tart without a little bit of this dosage added to kind of round it out. Back in the day, there was like 50 grams of sugar added per liter for many champagnes. That's changed a lot now. This is under the category of brut, which is most traditional to find on champagne bottles. And to be brut classification, you have to have less than 12 grams of sugar per liter. And here is about 10. So definitely well balanced here, but definitely not the style that's becoming a little bit more popular now, which is called zero dosage, where sometimes producers actually add none. Also, something fun here is you have not only dosage of 10 grams per liter, but this was disgorged in February 2021. So I always enjoy when some of these producers will share the disgorge dates right on the back of the label. It's just always really helpful. As much information as possible, I always love. And something else too to note here is, I don't know if you've ever noticed this on champagne bottles, but each champagne producer, if they're in the Champagne region, has a distinctive code. And you'll find it somewhere on the bottle. Here, it's actually down towards the bottom, towards like the right-hand corner. And you'll see it says NM 180004. So NM, if you ever see that on the back or the front of a champagne label, depending on where they put it, it means négociant manipulant. So what that means is they have the power to buy fruit from other areas. Though what's interesting about Moutard overall is they actually do work with a lot of their own fruit. You might have heard of a category more recently, especially called grower champagne. And if you ever see a grower champagne bottle, it will always have an RM as opposed to an NM. And RM would stand for récoltant manipulant. And it just indicates that all of the grapes are produced in-house from the estate of the producer on the front of the bottle, and that they do everything in the cellar basically and in the winery, if that's helpful. I'm going to continue to talk about this, but do you have any questions so far?
I do. Can you talk a little bit about why the disgorgement date is so important as far as the freshness of the wine goes?
Yeah, I'd say like what's really interesting here is the disgorgement date is important because certain champagnes are going to last longer than others. So I always also like to see producers that like age their wine as long as possible and then disgorge right up until they like release the wine. I think it just like usually creates a wine that has a little bit more like longevity if possible. And I just enjoy the fact that it's in their cellar kind of doing its thing before they release it. It's also helpful too, I think, sometimes to understand like the lifespan too of some of these like non-vintage house champagnes. If you understand the disgorgement date, then you can usually know a little bit better if how long something's been ready to drink, because it's sometimes a little bit confusing with non-vintage wines because you kind of don't know when it was produced or what year it comes from. So sometimes just a little helpful too in understanding like the longevity of the wine, if that's helpful.
And may I ask, compared to the grower champagne,
Yeah.
what percentage roughly do they produce on their own of the grapes? Do you have a sense of that?
Moutard.
Yeah, Moutard. You're right. They're not 100% because they're négociant, but
Négociant manipulant, but it's funny because every single thing that I've read about them and asked is mostly their estate fruit. So I would say that like 85% is like estate fruit, and they use small percentages of non-estate. So it's overall within that category. But I also wonder too, since they are doing so many things at the winery and they have a couple different operations, if it gives them a little more flexibility.
Yeah.
The reason that being a négociant might be really helpful is especially too with Burgundy and Champagne being such challenging places to grow grapes, it might give you just a little more flexibility to be able to purchase fruit if need be, if you're struggling a little bit that year. So I would say that I think of them more in a grower category because I think that they're very artisanal, but it's not 100%, so they could not put that, if that's helpful.
yeah, thank you.
Of
Quick
course,
follow-up question to that, please.
please.
I'm assuming that the exact percentage of in-house versus grapes would vary from year to year. Do they divulge what percentage is homegrown versus what's brought in, or is that something that they don't have to advertise?
They definitely don't have to advertise it, and it really wouldn't be something that we would probably find out unless like we travel to the winery ourselves and ask, just because most people I don't think would particularly, I guess, maybe ask that question, though it is an interesting question to ask. Once again, they have a ton of their own estate and estate fruit. So I think that like, once again, I remember I was surprised when I first had them come in that they weren't an RM, just because like they really do focus on estate grown fruit. But I would imagine that just once again gives them a little flexibility. It seems like from year to year, around 80-ish% is all of their fruit, and sometimes they have the ability to purchase if need be.
Thank you.
Especially too, since this is 100% Pinot Noir, but they make other wines as well in their portfolio. So whereas this probably comes 100% from estate fruit, if they're like, blending different grapes together, sometimes they don't always have, as high density of some of the other varietals as others. So maybe they purchase some here and there. It just, I guess, probably depends on the vintage and what they need in terms of production. But it's helpful.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah, please go
Can
for
I
it.
ask one? Obviously, the big houses need to buy grapes because they can't grow that many. They sell millions of bottles a year, and you just can't grow that many grapes. So they have to buy grapes from outside. Is that typically why champagne houses buy their grapes? Because they have X number of bottles that they're able to sell, and they want to sell as much as possible? Or is it the quality of the grapes that they're more interested in?
Are you talking about just for
You know?
different amounts in general?
I'm talking, yeah, in general, yes. For the smaller producers like Boutard or some of the other small ones that buy grapes as opposed to growing their grapes.
Yeah, I think it's, once again too, each vintage is like so different and challenging. So it's just sometimes nice to have like that flexibility. And like, it doesn't mean too, when you're buying grapes that you're like buying from like a large producer down the road. Like a lot of times it's like, small family growers that you're sourcing the fruit from. Like, for example, too, there's still a lot of champagne farmers out there that actually like farm their own fruit, but they don't actually bottle their own wine. So if you're a negociant, you could purchase from, another winery that's like making their own wine in-house and growing their own grapes, or you can sometimes just source from someone who's just a straight up grower of grapes and doesn't actually make any wine. So it just gives you, once again, a little flexibility, and it's just gives you also the flexibility to sometimes to source fruit from other regions too, outside of yours within Champagne as well, depending on like the balance that you need to strike.
So it's often as much a function of creating that style that you want as opposed to just needing grapes. It's kind of both. It's kind of both.
It's definitely both. And like it depends too. I mean, for a lot of larger producers too, like, the big houses, big champagne houses, first of all, a lot of those houses specialize really in the winemaking. Like, once growing grapes is a whole nother animal. It's not always something that like a winery can really tackle for certain producers. Some are better at actually just making the wine than like managing the vineyards and growing the fruit. So it's very interesting. Each producer is a little bit different in terms of like what they're going for. Any other questions before I move on? Cool. Well, I'll say just really quickly about the Côte d'Ivoire. Like, I think what's really interesting about this area is it is completely different looking than some of the more traditional regions in Champagne and the Aube district. It literally is actually a much more forest like driven region. If you visit Champagne, you'll notice that the primary regions, like for example, in the Vallée de la Marne or Côte de Blanc, are pretty scattered with vineyards all throughout. Whereas when you go to the Côte d'Ivoire, it's actually like a lot of forest and then some interspersed vineyards. Like, it's still like really on the up and up. And there's some really interesting producers that are coming out of the area. So it's definitely something fun to explore, but it's also definitely sometimes a great area to look to for value, just because of the fact that, it's not as well known. And so you can find some really cool stuff going on. There's also, interestingly enough, too, a lot of producers who are experimenting with Pinot Blanc as a varietal. It is a permitted varietal of Champagne. but a lot of producers who are focusing on 100% Pinot Blanc champagnes in the Côte d'Ivoire. So something quite fun to kind of explore and geek out with. If anybody is looking for some examples, I will see if I can track one down for you. Not a problem. I've actually had one myself and they're pretty good. And then I'll also say too, it's just once again pretty interesting about this area is one might think Chardonnay would be better suited possibly to the Côte d'Ivoire as its proximity to Chablis. But I guess producers have really felt overall that Pinot Noir is better suited here, and it's just a tad bit warmer than the more traditional regions of Champagne. So you get a little bit more of that like added weight and texture. So for me, when I'm drinking this wine, what I love about it is you definitely get in just like a really kind of delicate integrated like mousse here or a bubble, which is just like really beautifully integrated and feels like it's really integrated component with the wine itself. I never like it when the bubbles stand out and it just feels like you're drinking bubbles along with wine. It's really important for the integration to be there. And then you'll also find too that usually Pinot Noir will bring you more kind of richer, fruitier aromas. So I definitely get some of those here in terms of more of that kind of like riper, kind of more brambly red fruits, but also I get into that really gorgeous minerality that comes through as well. So definitely for a house champagne, something under $50, I've been really impressed with this producer overall. I'd love to see if you have any questions before I go into the next wine, as I could spend all day talking about champagne, let's be honest. We're good? Cool, let's move on. Awesome. I'm going to share my screen again and we'll go to the next wine. All right. So for our second wine, we have the Kansheim, Weingut Kansheim, which is a producer coming from the Mosel Valley in Germany, another classic. And this is a sub-region, one of the most famous sub-regions of the Mosel called the Saar. This is called Der Cabinet Riese. And you can see here a little map. It's just always so helpful for us to get situated geographically. Once again, with Germany, the majority of wine regions are going to be right in the southwestern corner. And you can see the map of Germany to the right, to the left. I have a nice little map too of the Mosel, so you can kind of break it down with some of the more most well-known villages. And you have the Saar here, which as you can see is about 1900 acres, and some of the steepest hillsides, which makes some of the best Riesling. The town that Kansheim is in is Kans, which you can see here just south of Trier. I'm going to X out of here for a sec and go back. Amazing. Awesome. So we have a 2019 vintage. This was a vintage, we'll chat through vintage a little bit with Riesling. That was actually quite challenging for Kansheim and for a lot of Mosel producers in general, as they did have some hail events that were a little challenging. And then they also had a lot of rain during the harvest, which is never a good thing. It kind of can dilute the grapes. And it's always, it's amazing because throughout the year, it can just be one or two climactic conditions that can really affect the vintage. But overall, even though I think Kansheim's production in 2019 was less than 2018, they were about, I think, 30% less. The quality of wines has been really good and they've been very happy with it. This is a little winery that's a husband-wife team. As mentioned before, we really do love to focus on a lot of these small producers. This is another wine that's imported to us from Vineyard Road. It's a wine that we actually buy directly just because we were really excited about the quality of the producer. And this was started by a husband-wife team, Anna and Stephen Ryman. So they founded the winery in 2016. And what's interesting is they both come from a background in botany. So they've worked for many wineries, both of them, whether they be in Italy, Chile, throughout Germany. And they actually met while they were in school together, learning how to be winemakers. And they both grew up too with a lot of interest in biology and plants. They studied horticulture, I think, at the Technical University, which is in Munich. And their winery itself is really interesting just because not only did they want to focus on kind of the classic style of Mosel Riesling, but they wanted to focus on some of the more classic methods of production, all hand harvested, just kind of that painstaking work of the weeding and all of the different things that are involved in the day-to-day are things that make them, both of them, incredibly happy, as they have just a real love for plants. And they also too are using more kind of natural approaches to winemaking in terms of like using indigenous yeast for fermentation, but they're aging the majority of their wines in a combination of older barrels and stainless steel. So we have the 2019 Der Cabinet Riesling. So this is a cabinet style Riesling, which is part of basically the Product wine system in Germany, which is classifying the wines based on sweetness or amount of sugar in the grapes. Cabinet is the driest of the levels. So typically cabinets are really interesting as you can find them dry to a little off dry, depends. One thing that I always find really helpful in terms of like understanding the sweetness of a Riesling from the Mosel is to look at the alcohol by volume. This is 9%. So usually if it's under like 10.5 or so, you'll find more hints of residual sugar. We have here not only the kind of spontaneous fermentation, but we have these just like beautiful classic Mosel Riesling aromatics here. So for me, I definitely get a lot of that kind of lime, like almost a little more of like a tropical lime note, a lot of spices, a lot of that kind of peach and pear. And then you get those really subtle elements too of a little bit of a smoky characteristic and sometimes a little bit of that really beautiful petrol quality that you get from the blue slate soils of the area. When I'm tasting this wine, it definitely has that acidity that's somewhat searing for Riesling, which makes it so wonderful. And it's actually a lot lighter on the palate than I expected it to be. The like sweetness comes through up front, but for me, it goes away towards the finish and the freshness really lingers for me. So this is something that I was actually really enjoying. I actually had paired this originally with, I think, a seared scallop with a green apple slaw. I don't know if anybody was able to taste those two together. How was it, Christina?
I made that. So I made the exact recipe from the suggested pairing this week with the Riesling, and it worked wonderfully. And whenever I like a recipe, I tried something new or I have a repeat, and this landed in the repeat bucket.
That's really exciting. That's always a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, I thought that was just like a really, really fun combination, and definitely with sometimes the more texture that the cabinet style Rieslings have, pairing it with the scallop or something with a little bit more oomph to it, I thought was really nice. And I just am such a fan of these wines. And sometimes I forget about Riesling. And whenever I revisit it, I just am like, why don't I drink this on the regular? It's just amazing. There's so many great styles of wine out here. And this, in my opinion, really embodies kind of a classic iteration of Mosel style cabinet Riesling. So I've just been really, really happy with the wines from this producer. They're relatively new, once again, younger kind of producer, bringing that youthful energy to the Mosel. And we've actually been finding that a lot, like the last couple of years, a lot of these kind of younger producers coming in and really shaking things up, but at the same time, still respecting the traditional ways. And I've been wanting to check out their winery when I hopefully book a trip in the near future to Germany, as it seems really interesting. Not only are they focused on kind of more traditional winemaking, but they also really try to incorporate a lot of traditional literature, music, food in the winery as well. So it's kind of like I guess, an immersive experience, which seems quite cool. Any questions on the Consign?
I have a question, and it could just be an optical illusion, but it looks like the color of this bottle is different than normal Germany colors. It's like more blue.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It does have like a little bit of a different
It does have kind of a
A
teal.
little more like teal. Yeah, that's like what I was just gonna say. That's so interesting. It's more beautiful than that traditional like German
Yeah.
green. And I don't know who they're sourcing their glass from, but it's quite beautiful.
Okay, so it's not like
It looks a
style
little,
dependent. It just looks like they picked a different glass.
yeah, I mean, maybe they just picked like for example, I have here the last like
Mhm.
wine here, the Viode, which you can see is like kind of that classic green. And if you compare them, they're definitely very different colors. That's cool. I didn't really like think about it or notice it until you brought it up. And I don't know why that is the case, but I definitely love the color more.
Yeah, I'm keeping this for a craft project of some sort because it's really pretty, and I just didn't know if that different color meant anything.
It doesn't mean anything, and I don't think that they have a strict, specific color that they need to follow within, but it's definitely interesting. And I don't know if it's like green bottles tend to be the least expensive bottles to choose from. But this is like a different color that it does have a little bit more of a teal focus. So that's cool. Thanks for bringing that up. I didn't even notice.
I really like teal. Maybe that's why I noticed.
Oh, I do too. I'm a fan. Any other questions about the consign before I move on to the next wine? Okay. All right. Wine number 3, 2019 Buondono Rosso Toscana, coming from Tuscany in Italy. I'll go back to sharing my screen. All right. So I thought this would be kind of helpful as like this is in the classification of what's called Rosso Toscana. It's what's called IGT wine, which stands for Indicazione Geografica Tipica. It's the second level up of kind of the 4 levels of classification of Italian wine. But Buondono is actually a producer that is most well known for their Chianti wine. So just to kind of show you where they are, they're based in Tuscany, of course, where Chianti lies. And you can see here on the map that red region within Tuscany outlines the Chianti region, which is just right in between, as you can see, Florence and Siena. And you can see here some of the different like classic villages within Chianti. The Buondono is actually based right close to Castellina in Chianti. So you can see that's kind of in the southwestern-ish corner. So I want to kind of give you a little insight into exactly where you are. And I'll get out of here. Oops. Actually, we're in here again. We'll stay in here. So this is just another map here, just kind of showing you exactly where Castellina and Chianti is. You can see actually up here, there are some of the kind of top Chianti Classico producers. You can kind of see where they fall. Buondono isn't in there because they're a small producer. They're not kind of as esteemed as some of the larger, more well-known producers. But we're excited to actually start working with them as they're relatively new to the market. I think they just arrived within this year to Massachusetts. So this is another wine, and I feel like a broken record. As, actually, all of these wines tonight come from the importer Vineyard Road, which is also a distributor we work with. We do a ton of work with them as, once again, they really believe in a lot of the same values that we do at Gordon's and at CruBox, which is working with kind of smaller family-owned domains. And they have really great tastes in wine, so we love them. But this is a cool little producer that they just picked up. Technically, the village that it comes from within Castellina in Chianti is Casavecchia alla Piazza. And it's just a tiny little family winery, I think around 7,000 bottles in production of this wine, which is run by an agronomist. His name is Gabriele Buondono and his family. The farmhouse where they run the winery dates back to the 1500s. And they took over the winery several generations ago. The farm covers about 22 hectares, 10 of which farm the vineyards, and the rest of which they make. They grow olives, they grow many different olives for like their extra virgin olive oil, and then they are beekeepers as well. They make their own honey. And Marta, who is the daughter of Gabriele, makes her own goat cheese. So you can go visit there, taste some great Sangiovese based wines, but also have some really delicious snacks as well. And you can actually, not only that, you can stay at this winery as well. The cool thing about Tuscany and so many parts of Italy that I love is you can actually a lot of times stay at a lot of these wineries, and it's, in my opinion, one of the best experiences as you really like get to know the family, and sometimes they have restaurants in the little places to stay as well. And it's just so much fun. So we have here their entry-level wine. So this is their Rosso Toscana. It's not going to fall within the Chianti classification because of the fact that it's not typically aged for as long as most Chianti. And then it's also too just a wine that's meant to be kind of more youthful and fresh. Chianti wines can also be like not always super age worthy, but once again, this is just something that they can make that gives them a little bit more flexibility and lets them make something that they can release right away and just be something kind of for the everyday. Whereas some of the Chiantis that they produce are kind of meant for a little bit more aging, or maybe for a more kind of serious fine meal. With this being Toscana Rosso, it actually does have about 90 to 100% Sangiovese. Sangiovese also is the predominant grape of Chianti as well. But they have some blending varietals here that they'll use, which change from year to year. The grapes are Canaiolo. Canaiolo is actually well known. It's a red grape, which you actually use in a lot of Chianti wines as a classic indigenous varietal, which softens the Sangiovese a little bit. As a grape, Sangiovese is definitely known for a really good acidity and kind of firm tannin. So Canaiolo can sometimes soften it up. And actually a lot of producers now are using Merlot to do the exact same thing. So there's a little Merlot in here too. Merlot has like such high yield, so it's really easy to plant. It can just offer some fruit, especially in challenging vintages. And then Syrah can sometimes be present in this wine in small quantities. And the Syrah could also add to kind of the aromatics and also give it a little more structure. The soils from which this wine is grown are more of these calcareous clay schist soils, which give the wines a lot of freshness and also some depth of fruit. And the wine is made with spontaneous fermentation, with maceration taking place in cement and stainless steel vats. And then the wine is aged in oak barrels that have been used several times, not to impart the flavor, but just to kind of add texture, and partially in concrete vats. And it's aged, I think, for about 6 months or so before release. So we'll taste and enjoy. First of all, for me, there's nothing better. Like you might know if you've tasted wine with me before that Italy is like really where my heart lies. Even though I always keep an open mind, but I get very exuberant when I speak about Italian wine. And Sangiovese and Nebbiolo are two grapes that I just can't get enough of. So it doesn't matter if it's a more kind of aged iteration or something that's just meant to be fresh. What I love about Sangiovese is its ability to just have these aromatics that really leap out of the glass that are typically more red fruit focused, but sometimes also give you those underbrush characteristics, almost like when you're walking through the forest, you know, those like fallen leaves, just like those beautiful kind of more woodsy aromatics that I just think make the wine so gorgeous.
Or just petrochlor, maybe.
A little what?
You might be thinking of the petrochlor. It's
Oh, yes, yes. I love that word. That's exactly what I'm thinking of. It's a great term. But on the palate too, this is just that great acidity. It's just fresh, it's clean. Definitely a food pairing wine. A lot of these like kind of younger Sangioveses, not necessarily something I just like pop and pour like by myself. I'd love to have friends or family around and have like a really fun kind of family style dinner. So I paired this just kind of with the classic chicken parmigiana. I think it's just so fun and so easy for like a weeknight recipe. But it's always just great to have another awesome kind of weekday Sangiovese in your arsenal. And this is a producer that I just think is quite lovely. Are there any questions or comments, thoughts? All right, we'll move on. We can do that. We have our last wine.
We have a comment.
Please.
No question, just a comment.
Great.
I share your love of Sangiovese. Brunello is my go-to as far as big reds. I like that more than cabs or anything else.
Yeah, honestly, like I feel the same way a lot of times as well, just because sometimes cabs can be too much of a good thing. And when they're done really well, there's sometimes nothing better. But Sangiovese, what I love about it is it can appeal to so many different types of drinkers, depending on the subregion in Tuscany, how it's aged. It can be a little more Pinot Noir like, it can be a little bit more Cabernet like, and then it can be something on its own. But no matter what, that acidity always comes through, and it's just aromatically so complex and so fascinating. So I'm so happy that you feel that way.
I have yet to have a bad Sangiovese.
There's so much great stuff out there. So once again, I'm in your corner. I love it and support it 100%. That's awesome. Cool.
Can I follow up on that?
Please, Wayne.
I agree. I love Sangiovese, and I tend to go through spurts. And there was a period of about a year and a half, that's pretty much all I drank.
Awesome.
And now I'm actually into Merlot, and for some reason, I don't know why, but it's just my taste and my preference seems to change seems like every year or so. I just get onto a different grape and I go with it and see how long it lasts. But Sangiovese is obviously a one of the noble grapes of the world. It's fabulous.
It really is.
This is for an everyday wine. This is delicious.
Yeah.
It's balanced. It's easy to drink. It's one of those wines that you obviously would pair well with a lot of different foods, including game meats.
Yeah.
Also, I could just drink it by itself while I'm watching a ball game. It's got that quality too.
I always find with Sangiovese, or especially a lot of these younger Italian wines, sometimes I can't always drink them on my own because they just like make your mouth salivate, and I just need food with them. Like not even that I need food, but like I just get so hungry. And that's part of the fun. I always have like a little snack with me or something like going on, because I just like know I'm gonna get that like hankering. Just because that acidity kind of has that characteristic that makes your mouth water. And I'm always hungry when I'm around Italian wine, because I just start thinking about Italian food. But that's so fun. I love it. Well, Wayne, you made the perfect segue to get us into our last wine, as we'll be chatting about Merlot. So this is perfect. So let me share my screen again. Hold on. There we go. Okay, cool. So for our last wine, something kind of unique and different. So 1995 Domaine de Viode, L'Allan de Pomerol, coming from the right bank in Bordeaux in France. This was actually an interesting one that we came across. So we're always looking for wines that sometimes we'll buy directly from France in like basically bring over, and they'll sometimes be things that we'll get that not a lot of other retailers will get on the East Coast, or sometimes even within the country. And we have some really great relationships with brokerages in France, and that's why we're able to kind of secure some of these great deals where we'll maybe pick up 50 cases of something, 100 cases of something, even more sometimes. It depends on what it is. But our Bordeaux program has always been something that we've been really focused on. It's one of our like largest programs along with Burgundy. And our Bordeaux specialist guy, for anybody that's met him, is just so passionate and so interesting. I always feel like I learn so much from him. And what I enjoy about him is he's always focused on so many different producers, not just the first growths or $200 bottles, but like a lot of values. And he kind of spreads the love around the region of Bordeaux and not just the left bank. So we're dealing with the right bank here, which I have kind of a little map of kind of the three main areas to explore. And you have all the way in the left, Fransac, which is known for a lot of like value-oriented wines, typically more Merlot focused. We have Pomerol, which is probably known for the most expensive wines coming from the right bank, in addition to Saint-Emilion. Pomerol tends to be, once again, more Merlot focused. And then you have Saint-Emilion, where you have some sub-appellations as well, which is also tends to be more Merlot and Cab Franc focused. And these areas are all very exciting, but I'd say like definitely Pomerol tends to garner some of the most attention and money in addition to Saint-Emilion. And so sometimes it's fun to find these regions that are right next door, which can sometimes be better for the more value and oriented seekers of Bordeaux, which we all are. We all tend to be. So we have Lalande de Pomerol, and this is a producer that is called Chateau des Viaudes. What's interesting about them is they're situated in the village of Lalande de Pomerol. The appellation basically has two different villages. It has Lalande de Pomerol, and then it has another village called Niac. So producers can be within either or village to fall within the appellation. And this producer is actually, the origin of the state actually goes back to about the 17th century. But the estate, which is only, I think about like 3 or 4 hectares, is now owned by the Durand Tessier family. And Philippe Tessier and his son Thomas are in charge of the property. And Thomas, who's the winemaker, actually worked out in New Zealand, California, and Saint-Emilion before coming back to work with the wines of Chateauvillaud. This is a producer that actually really just sells primarily to restaurants and private clients. So they do have like a lot of library vintages that they offer, and they hold back. So we were able to purchase 2 vintages from them. We purchased a good amount of the 1995 and then 2008. What's interesting about 1995 is, first of all, it's pretty cool to just be able to access something that has that much age on it. It's really fun to be able to explore these wines. 1995 wasn't like a standout vintage. It was a vintage that was heralded for having actually a good amount of yield per hectare. So they were able to make a good amount of wine, but a lot of producers have felt like it wasn't maybe as like stellar a vintage for like long-term aging. But that being said, one of the few areas that they felt like the value really was there was Pomerol and Lalande de Pomerol. So kind of interesting. Once again, with this area, the main grape is going to be Merlot. They typically will have Cabernet Franc in smaller quantities to kind of bolster the aromatics, and sometimes a small touch of Cabernet Sauvignon too, to add a little bit of depth. The reason that you do find more Merlot on the right bank is you have more clay-based soils overall on the right bank, whereas the left bank of the river is going to have more gravel-based soils, which tends to be a little bit more friendly towards Cabernet Sauvignon. There is a little bit more sand too in this like distinctive area on the property. So it is definitely kind of giving the wines, excuse me, a little bit more freshness. This is a wine that's really interesting and was just like really fun to like open up and explore. Once again, Merlot can really offer a lot of these like darker berry fruits, sometimes like chocolate, sometimes a little bit of these kind of smoky or leathery qualities. What I found as this wine ages, it definitely develops a lot of that like plum, leather, gamey qualities, even sometimes too a little bit of that like kind of dried coconut as well. The acidity is definitely over time is going to like start to drop out, but there's still like freshness and lift there. It's not as much, I don't get as much at the beginning or middle, but it comes in more towards the end for me. And this is definitely not a wine that I personally, cellar for another 10 plus years. But I think it's like still very interesting now. And I think it's definitely a lot of fun. It's so cool to be able to find wines that have age on it. It's sometimes really challenging to find in the market because everything's usually always bought up. So whenever we can find something, whether it's 10 plus years, 15 plus, 20 plus, it's just always really exciting. Any questions about this so far?
Is there any left Or is it all sold out at this
Yeah.
point?
We should still have a little bit left. I might still have a couple cases, not a whole lot, but definitely a couple cases. So I can follow up with you on that tomorrow.
Okay.
Works well.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. And what's
Um,
cool too is they come in these beautiful 6-pack wooden boxes too. They're really gorgeous. I actually brought a couple home to use
Yeah.
them because they're just great looking. And the 2008's actually drinking really nicely as well. But it's just kind of one of these examples of these really small producers that you find out of Bordeaux that have, back vintages available, and a lot of which just sometimes you can't even find any information about this winery on them, like on a website or anything. It's just really one of those wineries that kind of, it's about who you know. So pretty cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Of course.
I'm actually going to have to exit, but thank you very
No
much.
worries. Yeah, of
Take
course.
care for now.
So wonderful having you join. We really appreciate it.
Bye for now.
Bye. Awesome. Does anybody else have any questions about the Chateau de Viode?
I don't have a question, but I had comments.
Great.
So one of my favorite things about this wine, and what is one of my favorite things about a lot of the wines that I really enjoy, is that every time I go back for a new sip or a new sniff, I sip or sniff something different.
Yeah.
And I find that every time I go back to this, I get a new smell or a new taste. And then my other comment was, I also made the pork.
Oh, cool.
I like to cook. So I also made the pork, and also another fabulous pairing.
Great. I'm so glad. It's funny because so we put this with a pot roast with winter root vegetables. Sometimes what's challenging to do is to pair pair older wines with food, just because sometimes the older wines become more delicate over time. So you don't want to have something that overpowers.
Mhm.
So I wanted to find a roast, as roasts are always, I think, the best with some of these right bank Bordeaux. But I wanted to find something that I felt like wasn't super overpowering in terms of flavor and could stand up. So I'm glad that you felt that way.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because as I was cooking it, I was drinking the wine on its own. And I was like, well, the acidity is there.
Yeah.
I don't know if the flavor is going to hold up to the pot roast, but the pot roast wasn't so heavily seasoned or dripping in sauce that it worked.
Oh, good. That makes me happy. It's all about finding that balance. And it's the worst thing that you can sometimes do for an older wine is to have a really bold pairing that just overpowers it. So that's always something that I try to be really mindful of. So that makes me happy. That's awesome. Well, this was definitely such a treat. I mean, once again, to be able to offer something that has this amount of age on it, I think is still a high quality selection is pretty cool. And there's definitely a lot of sometimes these back vintages that come out and you're just kind of a little skeptical. And we were all kind of a little skeptical at first, but I think it's showing up really nicely. This, once again, isn't something that I would continue to age for a ton of years, maybe up to 5 years from now, because I think it's kind of trending downwards. But it's still really showing solidly. So very, very pleased with it. And it does show really the complexity and depth that Merlot can offer. It can be so different just depending on where it's grown and how it's manipulated. So I hope, Wayne, that you weren't disappointed. Awesome. Let me know if you have any other questions before we wrap up.
I would like to know the
So
name
I'm
of Wayne's fluffy orange kitty.
Oh, Wayne, that's a question for you.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
Oh, Wayne, I'd like to know the name of your fluffy orange kitty.
Oh, his name is Jack.
Nice.
I didn't name it. So I didn't name him. He's actually he was my daughter's, and she's she's camping right now somewhere, I think in Florida right now. And so we've got the cat for a while.
So you're babysitting. Well,
Yeah, but I don't think I'm giving him back. I
he's,
like him.
he's beautiful. So let her know that Jack is beautiful.
One more question real quick, Chelsea, as
Yeah,
far as the domain goes. How much do you think it would benefit from, say, an hour versus half a day in a decanter before drinking?
Yeah, so I opened this wine up probably around see, 5:30 or so. And I do feel like it's benefited from time. It's always really challenging though, because sometimes when you get to some of these older wines, they can also like not benefit from oxygen. So you kind of know like right away, like I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you've opened an older wine, especially that's like kind of at its peak or winding down, and it tastes good at first, and then all of a sudden it just starts to become a little bit more lifeless or dull. So I would kind of test something like this that has a little more age on it, test it, especially with it being Merlot too, not like a Nebbiolo or something that's like needs tons of oxygen. I'd test it out, give it like a half an hour and see kind of how it improves. But I don't think it would benefit from such a long time of decanting personally.
Can I give my 2 cents on that, Chelsea?
Yeah, please.
Christina, you said earlier how the wines you're drinking change in both flavor and aromas as it sits there. And I used to be one to decant, and I thought that was the way to do it. And what I found was I enjoyed that development of the wines, the flavors and the aromas. And I found that when I was decanting them, they just went boom, straight to where they ended up. And I didn't get that development when I was enjoying the bottle or the glass. So now I don't decant anything. And whatever it is coming out of the bottle, that's what it is. And by the time I get to the end of the bottle, I enjoy that development and that evolution of the flavors. So I don't decant anything personally now. For that reason, because I agree with you that changes is very interesting to me, how it evolves in the glass and the bottle.
Yeah, I decant on occasion. What I never use is one of those aerators. I'm very anti-aerator.
Yeah, so it's interesting because like I would say too, everybody's experience with this is going to be a little different and they're all fun. But I would say that like sometimes I'll start off, if it's a wine that I haven't had before, I'll do as Wayne does, and I'll usually open it up, just let it do its thing like naturally. But once I kind of get to know how it opens up, like how it evolves, then if necessary, the next time around, I might decant it. And then there are always exceptions to that. I would say like, once again, when I'm dealing with like Nebbiolo, especially in the Barolo Barbaresco like range, I'm always kind of whipping out my decanter, and sometimes hours in advance, it depends. But for the most part, I like to also experiment and then kind of make a choice of how I want to go from there. I don't really use the aerator if I'm decanting. Sometimes it's interesting to see if it changes things just to test it out, but I'm always one that's a little bit more old school in terms of the tools that I'm using. I don't think you need so many different things. But I do have an aerator on my Coravin, and I do feel like that has been helpful, as the Coravin, obviously, when I use it, doesn't give me the opportunity to decant in any way. So those are my thoughts on that. But I appreciate both Wayne and Christina's feelings on it, because it's really different for everybody. And I think sometimes it's really is getting to know that bottle, getting to know that wine, and part of that relationship is sometimes there are some like ups and downs you need to navigate, and that's part of the fun. Awesome. Well, I'll say, as always, this has been really fun. I hope that you guys enjoyed the wines from this month. It's always so great to just be able to pick some really interesting wines for you all. For next month, I have some great kind of iterations of these classics from a different importer. We'll talk about it too at the end of the week as I send out an email. But as I mentioned, I think what I'll do for March is I'm going to go back to doing some in-person events, and then also just do a live recorded video too, because I know this is, I think, at the tail end of a lot of people's February break, and I think people are getting possibly a little zoomed out. But that being said, if you ever want to Zoom with me, I'm always happy to to take the time. I hope everybody just had so much fun. As you know, I can always be here as a point of contact if there's ever any questions that you have, anything that you need in terms of wine. And this has just been so great seeing you all. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy any food and wine pairings that you are having, and drink some good wine in the meantime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Chelsea.
It's great.
Bye.